All right, take it away.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ian Finlayson. I'm with the Energy Efficiency Division here at the Department of Energy Resources, and I'm joined by my colleague, Becca Edson.
Hi,
Um,
everybody. It's nice to be
and
here.
Between us, we're going to use the next hour to go through a summary of the energy code updates to the stretch code, and there are a few to the specialized code, with a focus on the residential sector, and then try and save some time at the end for questions. I will say that this isn't intended to be a totally comprehensive review of all the changes. We will be working with the various folks that offer training on energy codes to make sure that that is an option available to you. But we wanted to make this hour as productive and useful to you as possible. And so we cover all of the major changes. I think we can move to the next slide. So we're going to just recap a few things about how energy code works in Massachusetts, and then we'll dive in with first the stretch code changes for residential low-rise construction, then a brief segment on the specialized code where there's probably the least change. And then we also have time for a high-level overview of the changes to the commercial stretch code. We have a couple of slides at the end about technical guidance and so on, and we will save some time for questions. Okay, next slide. So here in Massachusetts, we thought it was worth recapping where the energy codes are in effect. And this chart sort of illustrates that for most cities and towns now, the updated stretch code is your building energy code. There are around 50 cities and towns on the base code. They tend to be on the smaller side, and 48 cities and towns on the specialized code. They tend to be cities or larger towns. So between the stretch code and the specialized code, the topics that we're covering today, that covers around about 91% of the population of Massachusetts, and so the vast majority of the building permits in the state. You can see that visually on the next slide, which is the updated map that's maintained by the Green Communities Division. There's a link to this which lists every town and what date the various codes took effect. So if you are starting a project, you can look up your specific town or city and see when the effective date was for your project. Okay, moving on. So we're going to start with the residential stretch code. It's the code for most communities, and residential is where we get the most questions. And just before we dive into some of the changes, I wanted to take a minute to talk about the various code pathways that you can use. The stretch code covers both new construction as well as existing building projects. And so you see them laid out in a simple slide here. For new construction, the default for residential is to do a HERS rating. You'll see that in that first row, new dwelling units do a HERS rating, and we have a table with the HERS rating limits that can be used. There is the occasional project in the residential code that can use the prescriptive path for new construction, and that's really limited to group R1, which are certain hotels and motels, and unusual buildings like boarding houses. But other than that, if it's new construction, you're using a HERS rating, or you always have the option to use the passive house pathway. We tend to see the vast majority, over 90%, of new construction permits use the HERS rating pathway. When it comes to existing buildings, which are still the majority of permits that you'll see, then there's more of use of the prescriptive code. That said, for large additions or major alterations or change of use projects, they will often trigger a HERS rating, and we will take some time today to clarify and lay out when it is that a HERS rating is required for existing building permits, because that question comes up a lot. For small additions, small alterations, or there's a new exemption for historic buildings, they can use the prescriptive pathway, the traditional tables, as modified in Massachusetts. You can also use ResCheck to allow some trade-off in those prescriptive tables. And then, as with new construction, if a project wants to pursue passive house, either the passive house pathway for new construction or the NFIT pathway, which is designed for existing buildings, then that is always an option. Okay, next slide. So here in sort of one slide are the major changes to the stretch code with the update that took effect last week. Well, it's 2 weeks ago now. We will go through these in more detail, but I just wanted to give you the high level, and then my colleague Becca will go through the more detailed application. And the general intention here, based on the high level of public comment that we received through the formal process, as well as the steady stream of project-related questions that we're getting through our stretch code at mass.gov email inbox, is to improve the usability of the code. So you'll see consistently throughout these updates, we're trying to respond to comments from projects, from the experience of the last couple of years, to make it easier for people to build to the stretch code. So that starts with the HERS ratings, and you'll see a few different changes in the HERS ratings. Just to go through the list here, we've added a new credit for projects that pursue embodied carbon in either their choice of insulation products or their choice of cement ready mixes. That's not necessarily a big change in that this is just an optional credit. And so projects don't need to pay any attention to this if they don't want to. But we're hopeful that a lot of builders and designers will see the advantage in trying for this credit. Another change that's been in the news recently is that there are new regulations statewide for accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. And so recognizing that this was coming, we added a carve out specifically for ADUs, so that it's clear what HERS rating requirements would apply to those units. Because by definition, ADUs are separate dwelling units, it's in the name, it's fairly straightforward that the HERS rating pathway applies, but because they tend to be smaller and on constrained sites, we felt that it was appropriate to give them a less stringent HERS rating than you would find for a traditional single-family home. Finally, and probably the area where we've got the most comments on the HERS rating side, there are changes to existing building permits. So the overall building permits are relaxed, and Becca will go through that in some detail. And we've added a clearer exception for historic homes that are being either altered or having additions put on them. And then related to that, you'll see that we've made some modest changes to the prescriptive path as well. So where you're exempted from a HERS rating and you move to the prescriptive path, we've modified the R values for ceilings, and also taken away the solar heat gain coefficient requirements to give window design more flexibility. So that is the high-level overview. I think it's going to be helpful to walk through some examples, and so I'm going to hand over to Becca now to go through that in the next few slides.
Great. Yeah, so here we will zoom into some of the specific changes that were made. Again, this is the residential stretch code. The HERS table for commercial is slightly different, so you'll see that later on. But as you'll see on this table, we've relieved some of the numbers overall for the HERS ratings. For new construction, the numbers have stayed the same: 42 for mixed fuel, 42 for solar electric generation, 45 for all electric building, and 45 for solar electric and all electric building. In the next column over, we're proposing some bonus points with embodied carbon credits. We'll talk more about these further on, but this is basically our dipping our toes into the embodied carbon world, and we're offering these just as bonus, just as incentives. There's no penalty, but basically you can get 3 additional HERS points if you follow either the insulation or concrete mix embodied carbon credits, which we'll go into further later on. We also, as Ian mentioned, in acknowledgement of the need and call from the state for more ADUs, accessory dwelling units, we are having a new column just for ADUs, partly because it's very hard for smaller buildings to get a low HERS rating. So this is an acknowledgement of the fact that I think it's a 900 square foot maximum size that ADUs will be allowed to be now, that they're going to be state mandated and not by individual town zoning bylaws. So an acknowledgement of the fact that it's harder to get a low HERS rating, we're offering a new column for ADUs. We also have relieved the HERS ratings for existing buildings that are undergoing major alterations, additions, or change of use. We'll talk more about this, but just as a reminder, a major alteration, addition, or change of use is when the work area exceeds 50% of the existing building and also exceeds 1,000 square feet or 100% of the existing building. So we'll discuss that more, but basically trying to allow existing residential buildings to more easily undergo renovations and alterations and additions and change of use, and relax the HERS rating so it's a little bit easier to do that. At the very bottom of this chart, you'll see footnote number C. So historic buildings, so a building that has been determined to be historic by some governing body, be it local or state or federal, are allowed to opt out of this HERS if they or are allowed to follow the next slide, which allows for 3.7 R value insulation for the depth of the existing cavity. We've heard from a lot of folks about how they have a really hard time trying to insulate the walls or the roof to meet the HERS ratings without damaging the historical integrity of the house. So if it's determined that you have a historic building by a governing authority, then you're allowed to opt out of the HERS rating and instead follow this R 3.7 per inch. This table itself is available further on in the stretch code for sort of normal alterations, so alterations that don't trigger the major alteration category. All right. Here's an example. This is something that we didn't necessarily change, but we realized we needed to clarify because we get a lot of questions about it. So basically, what is a large alteration or a major alteration, depending on which section of the code you're looking at? So just to clarify, if you have an existing house with an existing basement, so the image on the left, and the basement is not currently conditioned, but it's there, and you're deciding, or somebody's deciding they want to finish that basement. If you're not growing the space, the actual physical square footage of that basement, but you're adding it to the building envelope, the conditioned building envelope, that does not trigger a HERS rating, even if it's over 1,000 square feet. This is because we're acknowledging that that basement's there. You're not adding onto it, and honestly, it's probably been receiving some of the heating and cooling anyway from above. So if you're finishing it, that does not trigger a HERS rating. You follow prescriptive in that case. And then the image on the right shows, however, if you had a existing, say, 1,200 square foot basement, and then you add on a small bump out to the house, and that bump out has a full basement that connects to the existing, you now will trigger the HERS rating if you're over 1,000 square feet total for that basement, because that basement has been added onto and is entering into the conditioned space of the building. So again, this is just to clarify, this is not a change, but we found this was a common question that came up. Similarly, same situation, same section of code. If you have an attic, you are going to finish your attic, but you're not growing the usable square footage, you're not adding a dormer, that does not trigger a HERS rating, even if the existing attic is larger than 1,000 square feet. However, though, if you then decide you are going to change the roof line and you add a dormer or some other, somehow you change the roof line in another way, you've now grown that existing space, and so you will trigger a HERS rating. Just to clarify. Okay, so again, when is a HERS rating required and when isn't a HERS rating required? Again, this is for existing buildings in the residential code. So there are two sort of buckets that you have to satisfy in order to meet the HERS rating. First, the work area has to exceed 50% of the existing house. So if you're touching more than 50% of the existing house, if your work area is larger than that, and you're also exceeding 1,000 square feet, so say you're adding on an addition, or you're exceeding 100% of the existing conditioned floor area, then a HERS rating is required. If you don't meet both of those thresholds, then a HERS rating is not required. And to talk more about the ADUs, you may or you may not know that with an accessory dwelling unit, you can have it be attached to an existing house, or you can have it be a separate building on the same property. There's been some confusion. Well, what if I have an ADU that I'm adding onto an existing house? Does it then trigger a HERS rating? Does the whole house have to have a HERS rating? The answer is that either way, whether or not it's attached or detached, it triggers a HERS rating. The HERS rating is just for that ADU, because by definition, the ADU is its own separate dwelling unit. So the HERS rating will not trigger a HERS rating on the existing house if you're just adding the HERS, even if it's attached. And if it's detached, then it's much more straightforward, and it's just a small new building out back. Either way, you're going to meet the ADU HERS numbers from the chart that we previously showed. All right, I'll pass it back to Ian.
Okay, thank you, Becca. And can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so I'm going to take a couple of slides to talk about this new credit for embodied carbon. This was a very popular request in the public comments, and it is new to the code, but it is also optional. So if you want to ignore this as a developer or builder, you can, but there is a real incentive to do this because it will give you some design flexibility. So this first option, or essentially there's two options. One is to achieve embodied carbon credit through your insulation usage, and the second is through the concrete that's used in the new construction. And to clarify, these points are only for new construction. it's much easier to make decisions about your insulation products or the concrete in the building at new construction than it is in renovation or alteration projects. So this embodied carbon through insulation idea came from the state of Vermont, who have a similar incentive, although not with HERS ratings. And essentially what has been done here in the table that you see a section of on the right-hand side is that folks around the country have collected the default values for the carbon embodied in a kilogram kilogram of carbon in a square meter of these various insulation materials. And you can see in that table on the right that some of these are positive, greater than 0, and some of them are negative, less than 0. And so those negative values, and you'll see here in the table that applies for cellulose and cork, but there are other products as well. These are essentially biomass-based materials that are storing carbon when they're installed in a building. And so in a building, as illustrated on the left, there'll typically be a insulation strategy for the walls, for the ceiling, for the floor, and then a different product mix for insulation in the below grade. For example, here we're showing the basement walls in blue. It's more difficult to achieve low embodied carbon in the basement wall situation or under the slab on a slab on grade construction. And so what we're seeing as a strategy here to get to net zero is to use biomass-based products for the above grade insulation that have a negative global warming potential and see if that will outweigh or outbalance the use of more typical foam board or other products for the below grade insulation. I'm generalizing because there's a lot of options here for how people can insulate homes or other larger residential buildings, because this applies to multifamily as well. But the essential equation is you add up the area of all your net negative or carbon storing insulation products and the area of your net positive carbon producing products. And then we will provide a standard calculation sheet that can then be used by the builder and supplied to the HERS rater and the building official to show whether that construction project qualifies for these 3 HERS bonus points. So there will be more sort of standard materials on that coming soon. We recognize that there are folks that are very eager to get started with this. But the good news is that the math is relatively straightforward. You're just taking the values from the table, multiplying them by the area, and seeing what the net result is. It is possible if you have a product that's maybe not reflected in the table, then you can show that you have an EPD or environmental product declaration form for that product, and then you can use that value as well. Okay, next slide. So this is the other option to get the 3 HERS points for embodied carbon, is to use a low global warming potential concrete ready mix. And this one is actually probably more straightforward than the insulation calculation, because what we're looking for here is for projects to use a ready mix of concrete in their project that is better than the average for the US Eastern region. And that Eastern region average is published in the table in the code, so you know what target you're aiming for. And most of the concrete ready mix suppliers in Massachusetts have done the work to invest in producing environmental product declarations. There's an example image on the right there. And so you, as a builder, can go to your ready mix supplier and ask them, do you have a ready mix that is better than average? from a global warming potential point of view. And if you select that, then you can get the HERS credit. Now, depending on the project, particularly for multifamily, but even for single family, you may have multiple concrete mixes used for different portions of the site, based on the strength needed for the foundation versus other portions of the building. So the math can get slightly more complicated if you have multiple mixes, but we want to make sure that you're reporting at least 90% of the concrete material that's used in the project. If there are some very small applications, you are not required to find an EPD for all of those. So we expect we'll get more questions on this going forwards, but again, we'll have a standardized form that HERS raters can submit to building officials to document this, and then that will allow for that 3-point HERS bonus. Okay, Becca, back to you. Becca, I'm wondering if you're muted.
Yes, sorry. This is an easy one. In recognition of the fact that the IECC 2024, even though we have not adopted that yet, but in recognition of the fact that they themselves have decided that an R value of 60 is way too high for a ceiling, they are switching back to 49. So we have decided to do that as well for the stretch code. So for this table, you'll see the change from 60 to 49 for ceiling R value. And again, we've also removed the solar heat gain coefficient value. So you're no longer held to a maximum for that. So just two pretty quick changes for prescriptive code there. And oops, sorry. Let me find my just a second. I'm trying to get control of my slide switching. All right. Hey, Ian, do you have this?
Sure. Thank you, Becca. So there are, what we just covered there are the more substantive changes. And if you were expecting anything sort of life-changing, I don't think there's anything that dramatically different, but we are hopeful that those changes, particularly on the HERS rating side and for existing buildings, will be helpful. What we're showing here are some of the more modest changes, and so I'm going to run through those quickly. And we, like as I said before, there'll be more detail on this in trainings, and or you can ask questions at the stretch code email inbox. But okay, to go through for new construction, we got some good feedback from the ventilation industry about updated standards for testing ventilation equipment. So we've updated the reference standard to the AHRI 1060 newest standard. Similarly for the EV ready requirements in the code, the original code asked for either a NEMA outlet, which is a standardized outlet, or the J1772 EV charger, which used to be the national standard, but increasingly electric vehicle makers are moving over to what's called the NAC standard, which was developed initially by Tesla. And so we're allowing that charging outlet as well, just to reflect updates. Similarly, we got some really helpful feedback on the language describing how to document passive house certification. And so there's revised wording for both the Passive House Institute or PHI pathway and the FIAS certification pathway. Not really a change, just a clarification. And then related to that, there was a lot of comment about mostly multifamily projects that can get very close to Passive House levels, but just miss them. In that instance, these projects are still better than the energy performance of many non-Passive House code compliant buildings. And so there was a request that we give these projects a ability to get certified and occupied while they either take extra time to try and get certified or just near miss on achieving that certification level. So that is a new subsection that's added for new construction. Then on the existing building side, we add on the Passive House front what is called the ENERFIT standard. That is a Passive House pathway from the Passive House Institute that's specifically designed for renovating existing buildings. And so, again, it doesn't change the requirements for existing building projects, but it adds a new compliance option for folks that want to shoot for that. And then Becca addressed this in the context of historic buildings, but the exception that allows for an R3.7 per inch insulation applies to any existing building alterations that are following that prescriptive pathway. So I think we can go to the next slide. And we've sort of hinted at this already, but we recognize that these changes, everybody will want to have more information on. And so we've been working with the Mass Save program and their vendors, PSD Consulting, to help update the training materials that they're using. And I believe there's a training tomorrow as part of a whole series that you can find online at the webpage below.
And I'm going to jump into, at the end of this, I'll put in the chat the sort of new website that we have refined so it's more direct and more easy to navigate for finding the stretch code. So I'll drop that in the chat after this. But also, anytime you have questions, please email stretchcode@mass.gov. We will do our very best to get back to you as soon as possible.
Okay, I think that ends our discussion of the stretch code for residential. And we're going to go next to the specialized code. There's a lot less changing here, but it's worth just talking through what does change. So next slide. So again, most of the action is in the HERS ratings options, which apply to residential low-rise below 12,000 square feet. And essentially, this just mirrors what we talked about in the stretch code of adding the embodied carbon credit option, and then also creating a carve-out for accessory dwelling units, that ADUs. So the table we're showing here is for the net zero pathway in the specialized code, but it also is the same values that you'll see in the all-electric pathway, which is that first row, and the mixed fuel pathway, which is that second row. The difference with this net zero pathway is in that final column where you see HERS index, including OPP of 0. That's essentially saying that if you follow the net zero pathway, then you use solar, which is your OPP, to balance out the energy use in your HERS index to get down to 0. So this table, we copied this particular table because it includes all the values, but depending on which pathway you use, you'll see a smaller version of this table with the same values in it. So for residential, that essentially the only significant change in the specialized code. If we go to the next slide, this is just summarizing the minor changes on the commercial side of the specialized code. So in the definition section, there are 6 updated or new definitions. Some of those relate to district energy systems, which you'll see lower down as well. Then in CC 105.2, the requirement for on-site renewable energy for high ventilation buildings. This, we got feedback on the occasional difficulty in doing this, particularly in constrained urban sites. So thinking about high ventilation buildings like hospital buildings or life science lab buildings, they're often using the majority of the roof area for heating and ventilation equipment. And so it's difficult to also put solar on that site. And so we've significantly reduced the solar requirements for those buildings. It's not totally eliminated unless there is shading on the site, and then it wouldn't make sense. So that is the change there. And then the other 2 changes that you see here are related to essentially campuses or other buildings on district energy systems. So where the heating and often cooling energy is coming from outside of the building in hot water or steam pipes, or increasingly now people are looking at geothermal sites. And so these changes essentially give more flexibility for the design of district energy systems or the renovation and alteration of district energy systems that are looking to electrify their buildings. Okay, next slide. So it is also worth mentioning a change that our friends over at the Mass Save program have made, and that is that for passive house buildings that are required for multifamily over 12,000 square feet, the incentive per unit has gone up. So it used to top out at $3,000 a unit for multifamily. That's now up to $3,750. And actually for single family, there didn't used to be a passive house incentive, but now there is. So for 1 to 4 family buildings that want to go passive house, again, that's not a code requirement anywhere, but it is an option. There are now very generous incentives through the Mass Save new construction program for those. Okay, I think that's all we have on the specialized code. And we're going to jump now into the commercial stretch code. So I'm just going to apologize in advance. These slides are not as in-depth or detailed as the residential sections, but we figured we'd give you a high-level overview and then see where the questions fall on this. So I'm going to go fairly quickly through these so that we have time for questions, and then we do have to wrap up at 3 o'clock today. So commercial stretch code, the construction documents section has been edited, not so much changed as edited for clarity to help with defining what's required for submission. The definition's similar to what we just talked about for the commercial specialized code. There are new definitions for district energy, and there's a modification in ventilation energy recovery. We've also added a definition for efficient electrification, and we've added that Tesla next charging standard in the EV charging definition. Then once we get into the main chapter 4 section of the code, we have added an exception for mixed-use buildings. And this is so that a mixed-use building, let's say it's primarily office and it's following the TEDI pathway for the office portion of the space, but it also has a parking garage. We recognize that energy modeling for that separate parking garage space can be complex. And so we've essentially allowed the prescriptive pathway as an option for that low energy or non-human occupancy space. Okay, let's keep going. And as you'll see, these are not huge changes to the code, but there are a series of improvements that we learned through the public comment process. So thank you to all the folks out there who submitted public comments and really helped identify potential improvements. So this slide is covering changes to the building envelope, or section 402. So on above deck insulation, we've changed the way you calculate the insulation based on thickness. On the wall side, for low glazed wall systems, we've added an exception that makes it easier to do change of use projects from commercial to residential. We've also, in fenestration, addressed revolving doors, which for some reason are not readily, it's not easy to calculate the insulation or U factor for revolving doors. And so we've addressed that. And then lower down, you can see we've allowed for a clarification on how to handle window sizes that are not standard, just to simplify energy modeling there. And we've clarified with an amendment one section about air sealing around mostly electrical boxes that are recessed into walls. Okay, next slide, sorry, which will be on mechanical updates. You'll see here that we have updated the references for a number of mechanical systems, both VRF, air conditioning, and heat pumps, essentially to adopt the 2024 versions instead of the default 2021 versions. That helps accommodate the fact that the testing standards have been updated and the 2021 codes didn't reference the new testing standards. So it's not a change in performance, it's just helping qualify equipment more readily. And then similarly for energy recovery systems, we got feedback from a number of HVAC manufacturers and suppliers, and that's helped us to better define these sections. And then as you've seen before, we added the North American charging standard, the NAC standard, to the electric vehicles section. Okay, now C406, these are optional credits that projects will choose to qualify for up to 15 points. So if you're following a pathway in the code that uses the credit options, so that's the prescriptive pathway or the ASHRAE performance pathway, then we've added to the credits. And as you'll see, similar to the residential stretch code, we've added in embodied carbon credits for both concrete mixes and insulation. So in the residential low-rise, we did that through HERS ratings. If you have a multi-family building, you can also use the HERS rating pathway. But if you have a non-residential building and you wanted to get credit for addressing embodied carbon, then we're adding two ways to do that through the same concrete mix being better than average, or having a net zero insulation combination between your above grade and below grade. And then finally in here, we have an update to renewable space heating, which is just a clarification to state that electric resistance heating is only to be used for defrost functions. We're really trying to support high performance heat pumps that don't rely on electric resistance. And then to clarify that when we're setting a minimum value for the coefficient of performance, just defining where that is set and what temperature that's set at. Okay, there is more additions to the district energy systems section of the commercial energy code for campuses or other buildings that are on district energy systems. This provides a bit more flexibility. It allows, for example, systems that are planning to recover heat from one building and use it in another building to qualify for the partial electrification requirements that are included in that section. And we have another example, a number of examples of district energy systems in the state that are making that transition. Okay, next slide. So passive house and HERS. Again, these changes are very similar to what you'll see in the residential stretch code. So we revised the wording for FIAS and PHI compliance with the input of a lot of public comment. And we added that near miss section or third option for projects that pursue passive house certification and narrowly fail. So, for example, if they miss their air sealing target by, a fraction of a point, then they can still get their certificate of occupancy, provided we have assurances that the building is performing well, without having to wait for the full certification process. And then the HERS index updates for multifamily buildings. As Becca alluded to earlier, we have updated those, but not to the same extent that you'll see in the low-rise residential section. So if we go to the next slide, this is the table for commercial HERS rating. So again, multifamily buildings, generally 4 stories and above. You'll see I've highlighted there on the right that the major alterations, additions, or change of use numbers have been relaxed, but not to the same degree that you'll see for single family or the low-rise residential construction. And that's based again on public feedback on what HERS rating values are needed to comply for alterations to commercial residential buildings. Okay, getting near the end here. So Chapter 5, so existing building projects that are doing alterations or additions or change of use permit. You'll see some general edits here. These mirror changes that you've seen that we've talked about elsewhere, but just some clarifications on when you have to do air leakage testing in additions. Also clarifying language around when an alteration to a commercial building triggers following the performance path, the prescriptive path of Chapter 4 versus staying in Chapter 5. And also adds a exception allowing for limited openings into walls. For example, if you're replacing some windows, but not otherwise opening up the walls, there's language that allows you to do that now. There's also a provision that allows for thermal bridges, so portions in a building where there isn't good insulation, but that are there already in an existing building, to be not counted towards the calculations you have to do to show that you've addressed the insulation of a building. So if you're essentially, it's following the approach of if you're not touching it, you don't have to upgrade it, and applying that to thermal bridges. And then the change of use section is just clarified from the language that we inherit from the model code. Again, because we had a lot of questions about when is a project a change of use that triggers the prescriptive requirements for new construction or not. And then finally, similar to the residential section, we've added as an option the NFIT standard as a pathway for existing commercial buildings. Okay, that concludes our quick summary of the changes in the stretch code and the specialized code. I just want to recap for folks that these changes are already in effect. The formal promulgation date by the Secretary of State was Friday, February 14th. And we got a lot of comments from stakeholders asking for these changes to be put into effect right away because they are generally providing more flexibility and relief to projects. And so related to that, where people have projects that are currently under construction that were permitted under a more stringent, let's say, HERS rating, we do believe that building officials have the authority to allow these new, less stringent HERS ratings to be met for those projects. We will be coordinating with our colleagues that support the BBRS just to clarify that and maybe even issue a formal guidance on that. Because again, that's been getting an area where we've been getting a lot of questions. But the intent here is to make it easier to comply and build to these relatively new codes. Okay, and so related to that, we have finished the changes to the code, but we are now turning our attention to updating the technical guidance documents. There are significant technical guidance documents on the DOER website. Hopefully you're already aware of them. Essentially all that's there still applies, but we'll be going through and updating them for changing references to HERS ratings. And then we'll be adding these specific things in gray here that are new to the code. So the sort of standardized calculation for projects pursuing that 3 HERS points or commercial 8 C406 points. We'll be providing templates that you can use to standardize that calculation for both insulation and for concrete. For district energy systems pursuing an exemption that allows for the all-electric pathway, we'll be producing some documents to help submit for a DOER review to qualify for that. And then we are working on more of the kind of case studies for residential additions and alterations that you were seeing graphics from some of the slides that Becca covered earlier, just to help folks walk through the different scenarios there. So with that, we have a few minutes left for questions. We will always 24 hours have our stretchcode@mass.gov email option available, but I'm wondering if we want to try and address questions from the Q&A.
Sure. I'll read a couple, and some of them might be quick. This one here, must new police stations get a HERS rating?
So police stations are not residential buildings. And so HERS ratings are designed for residential buildings. And so the police station wouldn't be required to get a HERS rating. If there was, say, a dwelling unit attached to it, then maybe that could be HERS rated. But in general, we're not seeing that. We're seeing municipal buildings like a police station follow either the TEDI pathway, if it's more like an office space, or the relative performance or ASHRAE pathway, if it doesn't fit into one of those set categories.
Okay, great. And another question that's typed in the Q&A section, is there an approved list for installation products that meet the 3-point requirement for HERS?
Yeah, so the 3-point bonus for installation products,
Yes.
there's a table in the new language that lists a lot of the common insulation product types. And so if you're using something that's in the table already, you can just take the value from there and then multiply that value by the area in square meters that you're using for that product. And do that for all the installation products in the building, and then see if it's above 0 or below 0. And that's how you calculate it. Now, if you have a product that for some reason is not in that table, most new products now are providing the EPD, the Environmental Product Declaration, and that will have a global warming potential number on it. And so you can use that number instead of the table if you're not seeing a table value that works for you.
Okay, I have one more here. I think it's more of a confirmation, but I think this comes, I think a lot of code officials see this. If all interior finishes are removed from an existing single-family dwelling due to fire or smoke damage, what is required as far as insulation? This work would be a repair and not an alteration.
Yeah, so the question of whether a project is a repair or an alteration, that's really a question for your local building inspector. That's not an energy code question per se, that's a building code question of, is it a repair, is it an alteration? If it's, in either case, if you are exposing the cavity, then we would expect folks to fill that cavity. So that's where in the prescriptive pathway you have that new R 3.7 per inch opportunity if you're allowed to use the prescriptive pathway. If it's a whole house alteration, that would trigger a HERS rating, and then you'd want to work with your HERS rater to see what insulation strategy you want to pursue.
Okay.
And I might jump in just out of appreciation of the fact that it's 3 p.m. I can copy down all these questions and send responses to everyone who, if we have a list of all the attendees, which I think we do, Joanne. Is that correct?
Yes, we do.
Okay, yeah, so I'll make sure to send, these questions and answers to everybody, since we just ran out of time, so that we can get answers, because I think there's about 28 questions. So
Yep.
Okay, yeah, and apologies we don't have more time today. We hope to have more dialogue and more opportunity for question and answers in the future. And we look forward to helping you all to implement these updates to the code.
Thank you.
thank you.